If you can't already tell, I have no theatrical background. I'm an engineer by trade, and that's probably as far in the spectrum as you can get between those two, but we'll give it a shot. It's a real honor to be here today to talk about the Oklahoma Conservation Historical Society. We are now 5 years old. Would like to share a little bit of the background and some of the projects that we're doing. First, and a big part of this is going to be talking about a history of soil erosion and flooding in Oklahoma. I think you really need to have a good understanding of that so you can know the importance of preserving and collecting that piece of history. And throughout that whole part on the history piece, you'll see pieces of what we're trying to collect and preserve as we go through here. And then have a little bit on the formation of our Oklahoma Conservation Historical Society, and this is a tag team presentation and collaboration in itself, so Tanya Finchum and Chad Williams will be talking about their contributions to that. Our mission is to collect, preserve, and share Oklahoma's rich conservation history, of which there is a lot. And this is really a story of collaboration and partnerships. We are all volunteers. We have on our board, and Ben Pollard is the president of our organization, has been here since the beginning. Raise your hand, Ben. Be sure to talk with him at the end. We're all volunteers. We have one professional historian, Sam Stolkup, who's on our board. The rest are historian wannabes, and we're interested in the history there. But we have learned the importance of partnership with the professionals, with the Oklahoma Historical Society, that you'll be hearing more about today in oral history. Department of Libraries have been a great help. Natural Resources Conservation Service is very interested and provided funding, as well as Association of Local Conservation Districts, the Conservation Commission, and the Soil and Water Conservation Association. Oklahoma has been a national leader in conservation since the early days, partly due to the critical conservation needs due to Oklahoma's climate and early farming practices, and partly due to the proactive citizens that were really active to address those conservation needs early on. When you read the history books, you hear that the early settlers found a sea of grass and fertile soil as they came in. But many of the early settlers that came in were farmers. They weren't ranchers, so they needed cropland to feed their families. And they came in. The other piece was that they came in from all different states. You know, a lot of states had their history where they evolved in agriculture, but with the land run, they brought people in from all over the country, and with them, they brought their farming practices and how they dealt. But many of them did not understand how fragile the land was, and especially the unpredictable climate when they started to plow up the grasslands to plant their crops. Back then, they really did not understand the impact or the energy that was involved behind the impact of a raindrop. And when it would hit on bare soil that was unprotected, how it would dislodge those particles and start that erosion process. That became very evident. It wasn't too many years after settlement before, and they plowed up the grassland, where you could start to see the terrible impacts of soil erosion with no protection on the soils. There's an interesting story about Joseph Mulbacher. He was an immigrant, came from Austria back at the turn of the century, somewhat of an eccentric person. He wanted to stay away from everybody. They called him the hermit out in Roger Mills County. But he was one of the first farmers that's documented where he understood the need for building terraces, where he'd kind of break up that slope on the countryside or on the landscape so that it would stop erosion. And he built terraces by hand, where he would dig those and build those ridges across there to intercept that slope. And that was back in the early 1900s before statehood. By 1920, just a few years after statehood, gully erosion became a major problem across the state. Some of the areas almost had to be abandoned, but they were not willing to take that land out of production because they had to squeeze all they could out of the land just to feed their families. There was a survey that was done in 1931 where, looking at the 16 million acres of Oklahoma farm ground at the time, there was 13 million acres that suffered serious erosion. And of those, 6 million acres were damaged by gullies. And there was about 1.5 million acres of those that had just been abandoned already by 1931. Between 1910 and 1930, there was a 72% decline in the average yield on cotton just during that 20-year period. By 1930, there was 3 times more acres that were abandoned as acres that had terraces and other kind of conservation treatment on it. So you can see in a relatively short period of time how erosion really took its toll. Even in the Panhandle, that was rangeland that never should have been plowed up. They were plowing up grasslands and turning into cropland. This one-way plow was thousands of acres of land that had previously been undisturbed that was plowed up for planting crops. When you take a look at the precipitation records, you can really see how this might have developed. If you can see back here in the 1920s, it was above average precipitation. So a lot of those areas that were plowed up, those grasslands and all plowed it up, they were able to make a crop on that because there was above average precipitation. That's when a lot of the soil erosion began, with that above average precipitation. Then we get into the 30s, and we had a decade-long experience with devastating drought. That's when everything started to really unravel. You've heard about the dust storms in the mid-30s. Black Sunday was April 15th, 1935. That was just one of many dust storms out there. There was just devastating dust storms that just ravaged the rural areas, not only in Oklahoma, but up and down the southern plains. You see all kinds of dramatic photos of the impacts of those dust storms. If you could imagine being a child and witnessing that coming across, of which there's been many oral histories where people relate the feelings in their parents and what had happened with when the dust storms came through. One of the iconic photos was out in Cimarron County. You see this many times when you're seeing about the Dust Bowl out near Boise City back in April 1936. I'd seen this many times, but while I was putting this presentation together, I had not heard of the photographer. And I did a little bit of research and found out it was Arthur Rothstein. And he, at the time, he was the son of immigrant parents who lived in New York City. He went to Oklahoma University, and he was a senior at Columbia University, and his professor gave him an assignment that summer to go across the United States and photograph agriculture in the southern plains and Midwest, which he did. He was driving through Cimarron County. He was 20 years old, and he took this photo. It turned out that was the most famous photo that he had taken in his entire career. He eventually went on and he worked with the agency called the Resettlement Agency, where they documented photography back in the 30s and 40s. He then became the head of photography for Look magazine, if any of you remember Look magazine. Then when that went kaput in the early 70s, then he became the head of photography for Parade magazine. And he just passed away in the early 80s. But I'd find out a little more about him coming through. You know, we've had this big controversy of wearing masks here in the last few years. I don't know if anybody had heard about those. This is back in 1937. This was in a Soil Conservation Service office in Guyman, Oklahoma. I was struck by 2 things. One, that everybody had a suit and coat and tie on. There's 9 people in there, and all of them have gas masks on because of the dust storms. These photos, these are some of the thousands of photos that Chad's talked about, but Soil Conservation Service back then was very good at taking photos and documenting them very well. On the back of every one of these photos has this documentation in the metadata. I found a couple things interesting, that on weather, it was very dusty that day. But then when you look down here, on the description, it says visibility was about 50 feet. And they had to use a flash bulb to take that photo. This is a little gross, but this is the doctors in the area, and we've heard that their business increased by 4 times, and they had to bring more doctors in as they'd flush out people's sinuses because they were plugged up with the dust that came in. But I thought that was a little gross. But even this was in the Panhandle, that was taken in the Panhandle, but they referred to doctors even down at Anadarko and how that was a sustaining business for several years. Hugh Hammond Bennett was a young man back in the early 1900s who was a soil scientist by trade. He came in and he was quite a promoter and understood the devastation of soil erosion. And he really started to make a crusade for soil conservation back in the 1920s. He eventually became the chief of the Soil Erosion Service and then eventually Soil Conservation Service. And he's been declared the father of soil conservation, very important. They were promoting the use of conservation and starting with terraces with horse-drawn skids. Hugh Hammond Bennett came out across the country and was in Oklahoma many times as they were promoting conservation practices. In fact, in 1929, there was a Buchanan Amendment, and he realized the need for data to begin to measure and show the impact of soil erosion. They got $160,000 on that national act, and the Red Plains Soil Erosion Experiment Station was the very first one, the only one that was funded in 1929, the first of 10. And it was in cooperation with USDA and Oklahoma A&M and the Guthrie Chamber of Commerce. And it's right along Interstate 35. If you just look a half a mile south of the second exit coming south of Guthrie, you look off to your left and there's kind of a goofy pond that was built out there. There are still a few of those flumes that was preserved. It really made me mad when I saw that they were building that pond and they just dozed out all of those flumes that they'd built, measuring all of that back in 1829. Immediately they started on some plots, they started building terraces so they could measure the impact of terraces against those that were unprotected. They had a number of demonstrations where they'd have plots where they'd have various types of protective cover from bare soil to some kind of grass cover to some type of conservation cover on there to show, and they'd measure the soil loss on each one of those to show the impact of that conservation treatment. So you can go back today and there's a lot of data that's still there talking about the data they collected in 1929 and 1930. From there, they used that on a number of congressional hearings and that to show the importance of having conservation treatment on the land. And this one here, the statement was made at that time that the rate of erosion on unprotected land and continuous cotton would come down to take away all of its topsoil down to the clay subsoil in just 30 years. But in grass, it could get to that point after 32,000 years. He would use those types of comparisons to show the impact of conservation treatment. They talked about the importance of that soil conservation practices was not just related to one practice. It was a combination of practices all working together. If you had some type of cover crops and terraces and eventually grassed waterways and structures, all of those working together to protect that soil. They funded a number of demonstration projects across the country where they could demonstrate how to do that. There was one two of them in Oklahoma, one at Stillwater and the other one down at Muskogee, where they would construct a number of conservation practices to show the impact of those. In 1933, they formed a temporary agency called the Soil Erosion Service. Hugh Hammond Bennett was the chief of that, and that started to take on a national effort, organizational effort. There was a big effort on trying to make this a permanent act. They had hearings in Washington, D.C. Hugh Hammond Bennett was quite the one for theater. To make his point, he was making a hearing, or he was making a presentation at a hearing on the Senate Committee on Public Works. He knew that they'd already had a couple of storms where the dust storms came in and actually was visible in Washington, D.C. When you read the historical stories, he was communicating with folks in Oklahoma City and across the route, wondering when that dust storm was coming to Washington, D.C. So they scheduled the hearing at the time they thought it would arrive. The legend is that, and I believe this has some historical significance, that he was at the hearing and he delayed it for a while because it was taking a little while to come in. He got the word that it was arriving in Washington, D.C. He goes over to the big windows with the big curtains and he pulls them back and he said, "Here ladies and gentlemen, is the dust from Oklahoma and the southern plains that's coming in. The dust was hitting against the windows. During the later parts of that hearing, unanimously passed the act that they were trying to get through. 1 month later, in April, they passed the national legislation. That was Public Law 46. That established a permanent national policy for conservation. It established the Soil Conservation Service as an agency in the Department of Agriculture. All of Oklahoma's delegation voted for it, and a number of the elected officials from Oklahoma spoke on the House and Senate floors in favor of it. They later developed a state soil conservation district law, and that was passed. And for the states, there was a model law suggested for states to come up with their own laws. Oklahoma was the second in the nation. Arkansas was the first. But in February 1937, Oklahoma passed the Conservation District Enabling Act. And it also at that time created an organization which is now called the Oklahoma Conservation Commission. The districts were all formed locally by a referendum. It needed a petition by 25 farmers. Boundaries were defined by watersheds or by county lines. We've recently found those original boundaries of those conservation districts, and they have been digitized and added to the collection that Chad's going to be talking about here in a minute. Also, there's authority to have agreements with Soil Conservation Service for planning and professional assistance, and also to facilitate funding coming through the federal government going to the individual local conservation districts. Those are 5-member boards of volunteers from farmers and ranchers in the area that would really direct the conservation program. There was a lot of promotion of conservation practices at that time, and training and education of farmers on the importance of conservation and on the details of planning conservation treatment on their lands. In 1938, that year, this is a map of the established conservation districts. You can see by the number in Oklahoma, that was one of the leaders where they were forming these local conservation districts. McIntosh Soil Conservation District was the first one in January of 1938. 11 years later, these are the conservation districts that were formed across the country. You can see in Oklahoma it was almost completely covered. It was one of the states that was promoting the conservation districts very strongly. By 1949, they were almost all formed. Kingfisher County was formed in 1956, and Custer County Conservation District was formed in 1973, which was the last one. But again, you can see where Oklahoma was one of the leaders. We always talk about the Dust Bowl and the devastation with taking all the vegetation off the landscape. But ironically, that was some of the largest floods in the state. You look at the flood of record in a lot of communities, and it's today yet they still stand from the mid-1930s. The reason for that was that it devastated the vegetation, so there was no protection of the soil. When it did rain, and there were isolated cells, thunderstorms that would come in and dump a lot of water in a short time in a small area, there was no holding it back. There was no way to soak it into the ground. There was no way for storage, and they would all flush off, have some very large floods during that time. Talked about Hammond. We've heard that a couple times today. The famous Hammond flood in 1934 was one of the devastating ones. It turned out to be 17 people were killed. There's some terrible stories of that. The Hammond itself didn't receive any rain. It was all just upstream. About 15 inches of rain fell in a short period of time. It was at night. People went to bed that night not knowing there was any problem. The Washita River came up, and there's stories where the Adams family in their house, they had I think 9 people in their family. In the middle of the night, the water started coming up on the first floor. They went up to the second floor. They chopped a hole through the roof as the water kept coming up. They all got up on the roof. The house was removed off the foundation, floated downstream until it crashed into a railroad bridge. 7 of the 9 people were killed in that family. A total of 17 in that area. That happened in other areas, and it really highlighted the need for flood control. So the Flood Control Act in 1944 authorized 11 projects in 12 states for flood control and conservation. It was a combination of conservation treatment in the drainage areas of the areas and then building the flood control dams. The Washita River was one of those. Since that time, there's been 1,140 flood control dams built up and down the Washita River Basin as a part of that program. The very first one of those, eventually, we now have 12,000 of those flood control dams under those programs that have been built nationwide in 47 states. The very first one of those was Cloud Creek Site 1 down in Washita County, just to the southeast of Cordell. Hugh Hammond Bennett come out, the governor was here, all the congressional delegations, the military band, all of the newspaper accounts talked about 10,000 people in attendance. If any of you have been around Cordell, this was on July 8th. Reports say it was 105 degrees. If you can imagine 10,000 people out in the middle of nowhere to come to a dedication and listen to the long speeches from the governor and the chief and the congressional folks, that shows the interest that was in that program at that time. A lot of the national leaders were from Oklahoma, and you see Dick Longmire and Ella Humphreys and Red Males and Nolan Fuqua and Lloyd Church. It's not surprising that when you look around a lot of these larger lakes, the flood control dams, they're Lake Church, Lake Fuqua, Lake Humphreys. They were the leaders, not only in Oklahoma, but they would go to Washington D.C. at hearings, and we have a telegraph where Dick Longmire were the arrangements for him to meet with the president the next day, talking about watershed needs. So that was for those 11 projects, but then the rest of the nation started saying, well, we want those too. So in the early 50s, they started talking about having an authorization to go nationwide. The person in the center here was President Dwight Eisenhower. He got involved in the effort. There was quite an argument between Corps of Engineers and USDA on who's going to be the dam builder. And this one was in the ag building in Department of Agriculture building in Washington, D.C. In the courtyard there, they're looking at a display of Sandstone Creek watershed, which is in the upper reaches of the Washita Basin, talking about flood control. He helped negotiate a settlement where the USDA would take the smaller dams up to 250,000 acres. The Corps of Engineers would take the larger dams. So from that, it went on, and the flood control program went nationwide. During the 60s and 70s, thousands of dams were built. In fact, a nice soundbite is that there was one dam a day, an average of one dam a day built for 2 decades across the country under this program. In Oklahoma, the soundbite is 2 dams per week for 15 years. So when you look at the construction that took place all over during that time, and they're just a tremendous workload. These are all on private land. They had to get easements. They had to go through the surveys, the designs, and construction. And these dams are still providing those benefits to communities downstream. This is Sandstone Creek watershed. If you look on the old paper maps, you'll see this is the first watershed project in the world, a completed watershed project, and where they completed all of the 34 dams in about a 3-year period. Now we come to the present. We've had quite a loss of institutional knowledge. A lot of those early leaders are gone. They can teach us so much about what happened and why it happened and what they did. And that's where the oral history program comes in, where we're trying to capture those early leaders that are still alive, where they can tell in their own words the impacts out there and why they did what they did and how they did it. The downsizing of offices across the state, and this is devastating, but we've lost all kinds of photos and documentation from those early days. There's just not the appreciation out there as far as of that historical value. So that started the digitizing these old photos that Chad's going to be talking about to try to capture and preserve those. And this, we always talk about it, well, we've always got a few people we can always go to, but eventually the old age truck is going to hit every one of those original leaders. So we need to capture this information and hear from them before they get hit by the old age truck. A little bit on the chronology of the Oklahoma Conservation Historical Society. Prior to 2015, we'd had a lot of conversations about establishing a museum. We thought it'd be good to have artifacts and surveying equipment and photos. And we even had a room identified on campus in the USDA building up there to house it. We quickly found out we weren't qualified to open a museum. But we could coordinate with other folks, the professionals that can help preserve it. So we had a number of meetings for 2 years on a steering committee to discuss different possible options for organizing. Finally, in 2018, we finally settled on bylaws that were finalized, and we have a 9-member board of directors were elected, came up with a membership fee structure, and came up with a mission to collect, preserve, and share Oklahoma's rich conservation history. That same year, this was so important, we were just a bunch of volunteers wanting to do something, but we needed money. The Natural Resources Conservation Service, Gary O'Neill, was a state conservationist, and he was very supportive. We got some financial support from them. Association of Conservation Districts was an organization that helped with the financial management. Oklahoma Historical Society, we started the project at that time for digitizing the historic photos, the thousands of photos that Chad will talk about. And then partnered with Oklahoma Library with the oral history program to start interviewing a lot of the early leaders that are out there. In 2020, the Oklahoma Historical Society, the grant that we received and the strategic plan was very important. That was not the most exciting thing on the list that we had, but we quickly found that we needed that just to get some organization in a direction of where we're going, and that was very instrumental. We also started gathering historic photos from field offices out there. Until that time, we collected about 10,000 photos just from our state office. And then we went out and started collecting them from field offices and got another 8,000 out there. We developed a website. Another contract we had with the Oklahoma Historical Society is construct 6 pop-up banners, of which 3 of them are out here on our display just out in the hall, so we can get the word out around. Last year, we finally obtained our official 501c3 designation and went through that process. So we are now an official 501c3 organization. We have helped lead some conservation history training for new employees out there so we can start to share this information with them. We now have a Facebook page. We have a new agreement with the Oklahoma Association of Conservation Districts for financial management to handle the funding piece. And we also received one of the Historical Society grants this year to produce museum quality traveling photo exhibit. So we can get those around. So that's our project we're working on now. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tanya where she can talk about some of the oral histories, and then we'll go to Chad to talk about, to show you some of the digital photos digitized. Tanya.
Let's hope technology works. Okay. To date, we have interviewed 50 members that they have selected. The board of directors of the Historical Society has chosen who those people are and have provided information to us, a little bit of background information on them, and then we've collected other information about them and preparing a question guide when we go out to interview them. Some interviews have been solo. Some have been teams of 2 or 3 or 4. Just depends on who wants to go to visit with this particular person that we're interviewing. We've been all over the state, interviewed technicians, engineers like Larry, employees of the Oklahoma Conservation Commission, Ben Pollard, who's in the room here, all sorts of people that are somehow related to the conservation efforts in Oklahoma, producers as well, and just members of the general population like Pauline Hodges, who many of you may know that name too. 45 of the interviews have been completely finished and are online, and the 5 remaining of those 50 should be up by the end of the month. And I will show you a little bit of how to get into those. This is from our library website. And you'll have a picture and a little bit of a summary of the person that we've interviewed. And just the nature of the beast, you'll notice most of them are male, white, but that was just the way things were. We've tried to get some diversity, and going forward, we may try to do a little bit more of that. Right, guys?
Great.
All right. In this process, we go back, we interview them audio and video, and then we go back and transcribe it, and then we send that that draft to the person, let them review it and make changes, and then they send it back to us, and we do a final version of the interview, audio, video, and transcript, and we'll send them copies of a DVD and a copy of the transcript to the person that we've interviewed, and then we put them up online. I have had to learn quite a bit, acronyms and history, and I can't keep up with all that Larry knows for sure, and it's been nice having someone that knows that history along for the interview to chime in with questions when I don't know what to ask. So we're going to listen to Hal Clark, a piece from Hal Clark. But from our website, if you go here and you click on the arrow, it'll expand it, and the transcript is there. The whole thing is there, and you can search keywords. It's kind of clunky, but it does work. And then we can listen to and see the video.
February the 25th, 2018. My name is Tanya Finchum. I'm with Oklahoma State University, and with me today also is Steve.
That's awfully loud, isn't it? To hear my standard intro. Let's scoot up. It's a little bit more interesting than me talking. Hal Clark passed away in 2020 and was a pillar of conservation in the world of conservation. He was inducted into the Oklahoma Conservation Hall of Fame, and he was from the Guyman area and born in 1932, so he had lived through and witnessed and made all kinds of corrections and helped with his property too. He owned a ranch out there.
Topic, so go ahead.
Well,
What are you thinking about it?
I had to jump back to when the CRP, are you familiar with that term? Conservation Reserve Program. That became a very beneficial program for the Plains. The Food Security Act passed in '82 allowed the Conservation Reserve Program. It's where cultivated land, highly erodible cultivated land, could be revegetated with permanent grass. A lot of land should not have been broken out to begin with, probably farmed, because it's highly erodible. The Conservation Reserve, an example in Cimarron County, because so many people had left because of the 30s and the 50s, the drought, but they had maintained ownership to the land. They cultivated land in Cimarron County, about 1.1 million acres total in the county. And that's another point. The Panhandle, we have about 3.5 million acres in the Panhandle. People realize the size of our counties. Texas County is about 1.2 million, and Beaver County is 1.1, something like that, roughly. So those three counties are much larger counties than what you're experiencing downstate here. When we went into the CRP program, over 70% of the tillable cultivated land was owned by non-residents. They had moved away, they had tenant farmers. They were taking care of it. So fortunately, when the government came out with a payment plan to put it back to permanent vegetation, it did take care of the tenant farmers that had been taking care of that land, which was very good. Just like Stan mentioned a while ago, we were talking about it, that was one of the problems with the AAA program back in the 30s when they tried to take care of the land. They ran the tenants off. They didn't subsidize them anyway at all, and that was part of the migration to California, because they were tenant operators. And a lot of people didn't realize that about the grapes of wrath, that people that had established, like in Beaver County, had established ownership to the land. They toughed it out the best they could and stayed with the land, because we're optimists. It's going to rain next year. We just have a tenaciousness with ownership, and that's what people need, is to have control of what they're operating and to have control of what they do with it. Again, that helps going back to conservation work. If you really have connection to the land, then you're going to apply the conservation efforts and work that needs to be done for it. The CRP is still in existence, and it has done a tremendously good job of helping control a lot of our dirt storms.
It's just a sampling of some of what we do, of some of the things we've learned. Downstater, that's the first time I've heard us referred to as downstaters. He had a story about that offline, so that was a little bit, it was funny. He was a great guy. He was one of the very first ones we interviewed to start this project, and I didn't know a great deal about conservation. I'm from Tennessee. I knew about TVA dams and mudslides off of the interstates from the mountains, and pollution from paper mill coming down in from North Carolina into Tennessee. So I knew those things, but I hadn't thought much or paid much attention to all the work around here. But you've got to think about that now too. I mean, the soil that we have now has to get us through the multiple generations ahead of us. And what I have learned from this is that, or a few things that I've learned from this besides what CRP is and EQIP and things like that, is that these men and women were very dedicated, passionate about their work, moved multiple times usually in order to stay within the organization and learn each time and get better and do more work on the other end of things. And it's really a history of conservation like they want, but to me it's a history of hope. These men and women have done that and preserved it for the next generation. And I get emotional over that too, just thinking about that. But it is hope, and their work has reversed some of the negative things that people in the 20s and 30s were doing. We still have some ways to go, but we are better than we were. So it's a history of hope, and it's a history of conservation. And we've done 50 so far, and we had an agreement, a memorandum of understanding to do those. It started out as 24, but each year they added, oh, can we do a few more? Oh, can we do a few more? And even though we've reached the 50 mark, it's, oh, can we do a few more? So this summer we will be doing a few more. But it's been a fun project. I've had to learn a lot. And thank goodness we've had co-interviewers to pick up the slack when I didn't know to ask. So there's that. We'll turn it over to Chad.
Okay, so I got started with this project. Dr. Blackburn called me when Dr. Blackburn, before he had retired, this is 5-6 years ago, I don't know how long it's been, said, hey, we're going to have a meeting and talk about the Conservation Historical Society. They want to do some scanning and let's see what we can help them with and go on. So we had created what's called the Gateway to Oklahoma History. Has anybody used the Gateway to Oklahoma History? So I don't have to go too much into that, but our goal was historical society collections to put them on. We just hit the 1 million item mark with the Gateway. So we have 1 million items, but an item might be a 564-page Chronicles of Oklahoma. It might be a 1,000-page book, but it might be one photograph or 2 photographs, front and back. And we have over 5 million newspaper pages. So it is our platform for sharing. So just like the Historical Society, Conservation Historical Society, collect, preserve, and share. That's what we do. And this is the way we share. And one of my goals throughout this time when we were starting to put things on the Gateway was this vision of, it's not just for us. We need to find a way that other entities, some that might not be directly owned by the Historical Society, might be affiliates. You're not even an affiliate. You're more than an affiliate in Kingfisher. And then organizations that might not have the means to put something online, or they could put it on their website, but is that going to last 20 years from now? You know, is that going to be there when other people take over or it change like that? So what we decided, talking with Dr. Blackburn, I said, we need to have partners where we can have places on the Gateway where they can have their own pages. And the Conservation and Historical Society was one of our first 2 partners. And I've learned a lot in this, learned a lot of what I thought I could do quickly and what might take longer. One of the things that when you saw the photographs, and then on the back there was all that data, and it was typed, and I was like, oh, we can make that, we can scan that image, grab that data, and just put it right into our metadata. That's what I thought. So what I learned was you can do that, and it grabbed that, but it didn't grab the entire everything. So there's a lot of editing to go along with that I didn't think about. But it was a learning experience. So everything's a learning experience. It's an incredible project. We're almost at 10,000 right now photographs on their partner page on the Gateway. But there are thousands being scanned upstairs, metadata being done. We'll be doing a big dump of more images this summer. We've just added maps. They had 84, I think, 86, 89 maps. The first half of those are on the Gateway on their partner page now. And it's really, that vision of partners and other entities that we can help, and the Oklahoma Historical Society grant program really helps fund that. So we can have the woman and manpower to actually do that and have some funding for that. So let me click on let's see if the technology works for me. So this is on the Gateway, the Oklahoma Historical Society. I'm gonna go back here and just go to the right. So this is the Gateway to Oklahoma History. Now the one thing that some of you have used it might not know, if you just scroll down just a little, there's a 7-minute video right here on how to search the Gateway. Trey Thompson, our new executive director, is 45 years old. He's a video guy. I'm help read stuff guy. And I'm 56. And he said, first meeting I had with him, I want you to make a video on how to use the Gateway. I said, why didn't I think of that? And we made this. It's a great 7-minute video. It's not too long, but it gives those little tricks on how to search. And because if you're on the Gateway and you're just clicking the button and say, what's in the Gateway? There's 1 million items. If you go to the left, resource type, there's 522,000 photographs, 470,000 newspaper issues, which is over 5 million pages. Now, in the next 3 years, we'll have all 14.5 million public domain newspapers on the Gateway. Text, maps, articles, the Chronicles of Oklahoma, magazines, journals, the entire run of the Chronicles is on here. Every word searchable. So if you're searching for soil conservation, we'll just do that. And what the video will tell you is use a little quote, soil conservation. Because that, just like any other searching, will only look for soil conservation together. 20,000 hits. If you just put soil conservation in, there's 70,000 hits. Because it's looking for soil or conservation, either or. So soil conservation. And I love this little guy over here. It says oldest. I want to see, what was the oldest thing created? Well, it was a newspaper in 1893 that has the word soil conservation. There's the issue. Somewhere in that issue of 8 pages, soil conservation. Over here it says search inside. Tells you where it's at in the sentence. And then you zoom and you see in gold where it's at. So the future is what I see. I'm sure the Oklahoma Conservation Historical Society has had meetings and publications and all those other things. So there's so much that can be added as we move on. And this is how you make it searchable. And then that video will tell you exactly how, because I'm not as good as the video. Hit standard view. Anything you find on the Gateway, tools download. You can download it to your computer. It's about a 400 DPI JPEG. No OHS logo on it, nothing. You can go right to your Facebook, Twitter, all the social media. But let's get to show you what our partners are. If you're just looking at what partners do you have, well, we're going to explore by partners. Conservation, the Carl Albert Congressional Research Center, which is OU's newspaper. You go on and on. We've added. We've got a dozen or so, and there's Conservation Historical Society. And what makes this great is when you hit the About button on that, it shows what that organization is about. It shows any data they want, contact, and then it shows at a glance, here's their 9,389 items. And it tells you what type of items. So there's 47 maps out of those 80, plus that are going to be up here next week. 9,320 photographs. One video. It was the first video we put on the gateway. It was incredible. So this is construction of flood control dams in the upper reaches of the Salt Creek watershed. It was great. He said, we've got this 16 millimeter film. We don't know what's exactly on it, and so we digitized it, put it on thumb drive, looked at it, and they knew exactly what was on there. So then you click on it, you're going to watch it. Of course, there's no sound with that. And I've never seen people so excited about watching a bunch of tractors and things. But these two were very excited, showing exactly what this was. And I said, well, I need you to write me a description of it so we can add that to the metadata. So here's the film that was produced in 1960 telling about that. So every word is searchable on the gateway. So if you put in Salt Creek, it's going to pull this video up. And then any of the others. Let's go back to, I'm a back button guy, I'm sorry. So back to their partner page. You can look and see exactly what's there, and you can look by decades if the metadata is good. And say, oh, let's see, what's the oldest thing we have? And I love using decades. There's 1930s. That's not the oldest, but. And then I love using the little middle grid because I'm always looking for some type of photograph. So I put the grids there, and for that decade, it's going to show the date created oldest when I click that to oldest. And then I can say, oh, what's that? And you click on that, it shows it. You've got the scan, the front scan, you have the back scan, and that data is not typed, so we have to keystroke that data in. So I bet we'll be doing metadata for a long time on this, mostly because people, and the great thing is people will find an image and they'll say, hey, that was my granddad, such and such, he worked for, because sometimes that information was not put on the photograph. But when you click on that, you click on the photograph, you zoom. It's about a 400 DPI JPEG that you can download. It's even bigger there. But you can see, you could blow that up, print it, and put it on a wall. And anytime you're in the middle of something, say, oh, I want that. Standard view, download large, and it's all yours. Let's go to a map. I know we're just over our numbers, but I want to show you these maps because they're really cool. That's not browse. You can browse the conservation, or you can just go right to it. And the great thing about these partner pages is then all the organization has to do is have a link directly right here. They have their gateway.partners, OKCH. And so they can just put it on their website or their Facebook, see our photographic images, see our archival collection. Click. It's there. That takes them right to here. You don't have to worry about the other millions of other things that might have soil conservation in a newspaper, unless you want to do that. And then you can go, oh, what's there? I want to look at everything, view everything. And then you can do it by what's the newest added, which is these maps. So you click on the map. It's got a basic information on where that was, Pontotoc County. And I love how the Gateway shows maps. Look at the detail that that you can get into and say, oh, that's where my dad's farm, granddad's farm was, or wherever that is. And then you're always like, oh, I want that. Standard view, download large. So these are the things that are really great about the Gateway and us being able to partner with these incredible people and what they want to do to collect, preserve, and share their history. One last thing that I have to do, and it's fun. Sometimes when I'm giving programs, I like, what? Let's see if. I think we're out of time. Oh my gosh! Oh my gosh! Somebody, black and we'll give you the black and white one. There he is. And then, of course, download large. So, well, this has been an incredible process and partnerships with Oklahoma State with their oral histories, which are incredible. Listen to those. And there's a little flyer up here that shows all these websites, and I'm sure on your website you have links to all these. But here's a flyer you can take, and then if you're really interested, you can become a member right here. So
Only $25.
$25. Larry, you have anything else you want to?
No, I